Study Section 5. The problem of poverty and social welfare. Introduction. In this lecture, we shall discuss poverty. To this extent, it will be appropriate to examine its types, how it can be measured, what are its various causes, as well as its effects on the people. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Define what poverty is all about. 2. Discuss absolute and relative poverty. 3. Explain how poverty can be measured. 4. Highlight and explain the main causes of poverty. And 5. Explain the various effects of poverty. Pretest. 1. How many types of poverty do you know? 2. How can poverty be measured? 3. What are the main causes of poverty? 4. What are the effects of poverty? Various definitions of the concept of poverty have been advanced. One can define it as a condition in which the basic needs of human beings, shelter, food, and clothing, are grossly lacking. We can also define it as the condition of having insufficient resources or income in its most extreme form. Thus, poverty is a lack of basic human needs such as adequate and nutritious food, clothing, housing, clean water, and health services. Extreme poverty can cause terrible suffering and death, and even modest levels of poverty can prevent people from realizing many of their desires. Over 1/5 of the world's population was living in extreme poverty in 1995, of which around 70% were women. Nearly 13.5 million children under 5 years die each year from poverty-related illnesses, measles, diarrhea, malaria, pneumonia, and malnutrition. In one of its annual reports, the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, said that 600 million children continue to live in poverty. There are different definitions of the standard of living considered to be the minimum adequate level, known as the poverty level. The European Union (EU) definition of poverty is an income of less than half the EU average, £150 a week in 1993. By this definition, there were 50 million poor in the EU in 1993. Despite the above, it is on record that the world's poorest people, many of whom live in developing areas of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, struggle daily for food, shelter, and other necessities. They often suffer from severe malnutrition, epidemic disease outbreaks, famine, and war. In wealthier countries such as the United States, Canada, Japan, and those in the Western world, the effects of poverty may include poor nutrition, mental illness, drug dependence, crime, and high rates of diseases. At this stage, it is necessary to differentiate between absolute and relative poverty. Extreme poverty, which threatens people or lives, is also known as destitution or absolute poverty. In other words, absolute poverty refers to where people lack the necessaries of life, such as food, clothing, and shelter. Absolute poverty measures the number of people living below a certain income threshold, or the number of households unable to afford certain basic goods and services. In many countries, absolute poverty is common and persistent, being reflected in poor nutrition, short life expectancy, and high levels of infant mortality. It may result from a country's complete lack of resources or from unequal distribution of wealth. On the other hand, relative poverty is the condition of having fewer resources or less income than others within a society or country, or compared to worldwide averages. We can also define it as the inability of a citizen to participate fully in economic terms in the society in which he or she lives. Relative poverty measures the extent to which a household's financial resources fall below an average income threshold for the economy. Although living standards and real incomes have grown because of higher employment and sustained economic growth over recent years, the gains in income and wealth have been unevenly distributed across the population. The reasons for poverty are clear. Some people believe that poverty results from a lack of adequate resources on a global level, resources such as land and building materials that are necessary for the well-being or survival of the world's people. Others see poverty as an effect of uneven distribution of resources around the world on an international or even regional scale. This second line of reasoning helps explain why many people have much more than they need to live in comfort, while many others do not have enough resources to live. Poverty has been a concern in societies even before the beginning of recorded history. According to sociologists and anthropologists, social stratification, that is, the division of a society into a hierarchy of wealth, power, and status, was a defining characteristic of the earliest civilizations, including those of ancient Egypt, Sumter in the Middle East, and the Indus Valley of what is now known as India. The rulers and other powerful or wealthy members of these civilizations frequently mistreated the poor, sometimes subjecting them to hard labor or enslaving them. Babylonian and Talmudic writings in the ancient era and early Christian writings entreated people with resources and good fortune to relate to the poor with compassion. As the powerful nations of Western civilization became established, they codified relationships between the poor and the non-poor into law, as was done in the ancient Babylonia. The present-day welfare systems of the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada evolved from a 17th century British legal act known commonly as the Poor Laws. The rise of civilizations also led to stratification among nations. Powerful and wealthy nations built empires by using the labor and resources of less powerful nations. This dynamism took on a new form in the era of colonialism. From the 15th century to the early 19th century, and from the early 19th century to the mid-20th century, countries in Western Europe and later the United States and Japan laid claims to territories, created colonies, and new countries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These were areas where people still lived directly off the land and where natural resources were plentiful. Colonizers variously sought to acquire new resources and productive land to spread religion, to find religious freedom, and to gain strategic positions against rival nations in political and military confrontations. During the first period of colonialism, several Western European countries, led by Portugal, the Netherlands, Spain, France, used their colonial territories to provide themselves with goods for consumption and trade. In the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution brought mechanized production to many nations and ushered in a second period of colonialism. Industrialization began in Britain and soon spread to North America, much of Western Europe, and some Pacific nations such as Japan. Industrialized countries could produce much larger quantities of goods and resources than had previously been possible. To achieve this level of production, they relied on colonies to provide raw materials for building and powering machines and for supplying their factories. The industrialized countries and many of their people experienced increases in wealth and ease of access to essential resources, including clothing, building materials, and staple foods. The colonies in Africa, South and East Asia, and what is now known as Latin America did not share in these gains. Often, the resources of the colonies were exploited by the colonizing countries, especially geographically smaller ones, such as Britain and the Netherlands, to supply raw materials such as metal ores for smelting or sugarcane for the production of rum. In the colonies, the production of food and raw materials for manufacturing diverted indigenous peoples from doing subsistence work such as gardening or tending livestock. Others were simply displaced from their land. Native Africans, Asians, and Americans who had been self-sufficient as farmers, herders, or hunter-gatherers now became dependent for the first time on outsiders for their basic needs, and many became poor. An exception to this pattern occurred in two of the world's largest countries, Russia and China. These countries used primarily their own hinterlands to obtain resources. In other cases, colonies were centers of trade in slaves. Many European nations, including Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark, set up outposts in West Africa, from which they shipped slaves to the colonies of the Americas and the Caribbean. These countries also used slaves for free labor in their own lands. Slaves suffered a total loss of home, land, and livelihood. The economies of the former colonies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America began to change only in the mid-20th century, when they gained political independence. Most former colonies came to be known as developing countries, or collectively as the Third World. The Third World is home to the world's poorest people, and Nigeria accounts for at least half the entire population of Africa. Consequently, it may actually be home to about half the world's poorest people. The countries of Eastern Europe, which were formerly part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, and the Communist Bloc, and the People's Republic of China, are sometimes referred to as the Second World. These countries have vast rural territories and a legacy of state-owned property, facilities, and equipment. As for famine, from the years of communist rule, they have become industrialized, but many still have high levels of poverty. The former colonizing countries, which are highly industrialized and post-industrial, service and information-based economies, have become known generally as developed countries, world, or the First World. Measuring poverty. How people and institutions portray and try to cope with poverty depends to a considerable extent on how poverty is measured. The differences between relative poverty, having less than others, and absolute poverty, not having enough to survive, are great. However, there is a wide variety of options for measuring wealth and well-being, and for establishing lines that separate the poor from the non-poor. Economists have traditionally chosen income as the basis for measuring and defining poverty, but even that choice allows for a multitude of options. While no one measure is necessarily correct, experts argue that some are better than others. International measurements. In international economics, such as in statistics kept by the United Nations, the measure of a country's wealth is generally based on its gross domestic product, GDP. GDP measures the aggregate yearly monetary income of all a country's people and businesses. For the purpose of figuring poverty levels, GDP figures are usually calculated as GDP, sometimes referred to as income, per capita. If two countries have the same aggregate GDP, the one with a smaller population will have a higher GDP per capita. In other words, each person in the smaller country has a greater share of the total national income. In the 1990s, developed countries typically enjoyed average per capita yearly incomes in excess of $15,000 and often $20,000. At the other extreme, the poorest countries often had per capita yearly incomes substantially under $1,000. According to one figure, for example, the per capita income in Mozambique, a country in southeastern Africa and one of the world's poorest countries, was about $100 in 1996. While people with such low incomes might be able to produce or obtain some food and other basic needs, they generally have difficulty providing for themselves. Levels of poverty also depend on how income and resources are distributed. Countries with high GDPs can have low levels of poverty if people have relatively equal amounts of income and resources, such as in Scandinavia. On the other hand, countries with equally high GDPs will have higher poverty rates if a few people have more income and resources than the rest. The United States is such a country. Causes of poverty. Poverty has many causes, some of them very basic. Some experts suggest, for instance, that the world has too many people, too few jobs, and not enough food. But these basic causes are complex and not easily eradicated. In most cases, the causes and effects of poverty interact in the sense that what makes people poor also creates conditions that keep them poor.
Primary determinants of poverty include 1. Overpopulation. Overpopulation, the situation of having large numbers of people with too few resources and too little space, is closely associated with poverty. It can result from high population density, the ratio of people to land area, usually expressed as numbers of persons per square kilometer or square mile, or from low amounts of resources, or from both. Excessively high population densities put stress on available resources. Only a certain number depends on how much food and other resources the land can provide. In countries where people live primarily by means of simple farming, gardening, herding, hunting and gathering, even large areas of land can only support small numbers of people because these labor-intensive subsistence activities produce only small amounts of food. In developed countries such as the United States, Japan, and the countries of Western Europe, overpopulation generally is not considered a major cause of poverty. These countries produce large quantities of food, through mechanized farming, which depends on commercial fertilizers, large-scale irrigation, and agricultural machinery. This form of production provides enough food to support the high densities of people in metropolitan areas. A country's level of poverty can depend greatly on its mix of population density and agricultural productivity. Bangladesh, for instance, has one of the world's highest population densities, with more than 950 persons per square kilometer, 2,500 persons per square mile. A large majority of the people of Bangladesh engage in low productivity manual farming, and this contributes to the country's extremely high level of poverty. Some of the smaller countries in Western Europe, such as the Netherlands and Belgium, have high population densities as well. These countries practice mechanized farming, and they are also involved in high-tech industries. Therefore, they have high standards of living. At the other end of the spectrum, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have population densities of less than 30 persons per square kilometer, 80 persons per square mile. Many people in these countries practice manual subsistence farming. These countries also have infertile land and lack the economic resources and technology to boost productivity. As a consequence, these nations are very poor. The United States has both relatively low population density and high agricultural productivity. It is one of the world's wealthiest nations. The reverse is the case in Nigeria, which has a relatively high population density and a very low agricultural productivity. For this reason, it is considered one of the world's populated nations. High birth rates contribute to overpopulation in many developed countries. This problem is especially serious in Nigeria, where children are seen as assets to many poor families because they provide labor for farming. Cultural norms in traditionally rural societies could sanction the value of large families. Also, the Nigerian government provides little or no support, financial or political, for families. Even people who wish to keep their families small have difficulty doing so. For all these reasons, Nigeria, as with other developing countries, have high rates of population growth. Most developed countries provide considerable political and financial support for family planning. People tend to limit the number of children they have because of the availability of this support. Cultural norms in these countries also tend to affirm the ideal of small family size. Number 2. The unequal distribution of resources in the world economy. Many experts agree that the legacy of colonialism accounts for much of the unequal distribution of resources in the world economy. In many developing countries, the problems of poverty are massive and pervasive. In recent decades, most of these countries have tried to develop their economies with industry and technology, with varying levels of success. Some nations have become fairly wealthy, including the Republic of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, and Thailand. However, many developing countries lack essential raw materials and the knowledge and skills gained through formal education and training. They also often lack the infrastructure provided by, for example, transportation systems and power generating facilities. Because these things are necessary for the development of industry, developing countries generally must rely on trading with developed countries for manufactured goods, but they cannot afford much. Some social scientists argue that wealthier developed countries continue to practice a form of colonialism known as neocolonialism. The affluence of these countries is based to a large extent on favorable trade with the developing world. Developed countries have been able to get inexpensive natural resources from poorer countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, including oil for power, ores and minerals for manufacturing durable goods and manufactured goods made by low-wage workers in factories operated by multinational corporations. This practice contributes to the dependency of poorer countries while not raising their standards of living. Number 3. Low standards of living and high costs of living. Because people in developed nations may have more wealth and resources than those in developing countries, their standard of living is also generally higher. Thus, people who have what would be considered adequate wealth and resources in developing countries may be considered poor in developed countries. People in the United States, for example, may expect to make an average of about $30,000 each year. They also probably expect to rent an apartment or own a house with electricity and running water to be able to afford to eat and dress well, and to receive quality health care. In addition, many people aspire to afford discretionary expenses, that is, purchase in essentials to survival such as cars, higher priced foods, and entertainment. In contrast, people in developing countries such as Nigeria may consider themselves to be doing well if they have productive gardens, some livestock, and a house of thatch or mud bricks. In rural areas, people may be accustomed to not having plumbing, electricity, or formal health care. By the standards of developed countries, such living conditions are considered hallmarks of poverty. Developed countries also tend to have a high cost of living. Even the most basic lifestyle in these countries, with few or no luxuries, can be relatively expensive. Most people in the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, Western European nations, and other developed countries cannot obtain adequate food, clothing, and shelter without ample amounts of money. In some areas, even people with jobs that pay the legal minimum wage may not be able to cover their basic expense. People who cannot find or maintain well-paying jobs often have no spare income for discretionary or emergency expenses, and many rely on government welfare payments to survive. The cost of living in Nigeria is thought to be on the increase. In fact, by comparable modern cost of living beyond the reach of the common man. Most Nigerians cannot afford decent accommodation, adequate food, and even clothing. Only the wealthy can afford the luxury of recreation or other outdoor activities. Not many Nigerians now visit movies or can afford the niceties of hosting friends and families, activities which at some point in their history were highly valued. Number 4. Inadequate education and employment opportunities. Illiteracy and lack of education are common in poor countries. Governments of developing countries such as Nigeria often cannot afford to provide for good public schools, especially in rural areas. Without education, most people cannot find income-generating work. Poor people also often forgo schooling in order to concentrate on making a minimal living. In addition, developing countries tend to have few employment opportunities, especially for women. As a result, people may see little reason to go to school. Even in developed countries, unemployment rates may be high. When people do not have work, they do not make any money. Thus, high unemployment leads to high levels of poverty. Availability of employment also tends to fluctuate, creating periods of high joblessness. Countries such as Japan, the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Switzerland, and Luxembourg have managed at times to keep unemployment as low as 2%. Unemployment figures during the 1990s in the United States and most of Europe, on the other hand, ranged from about 5% to more than 20%. In countries with high populations, unemployment levels of only a few percentage means that millions of working-age people cannot find work and earn an adequate income. Because unemployment figures indicate only the number of people eligible to work who have no jobs but are seeking employment, such figures are not necessarily an accurate indicator of the number of people living in poverty. Other people may not be able to find enough work or may earn wages too low to support themselves. Number 5. Environmental degradation. In many parts of the world, environmental degradation, the deterioration of the natural environment, including the atmosphere, bodies of water, soil, and forests, is an important cause of poverty. Environmental problems have led to shortages of food, clean water, materials for shelter, and other essential resources. As forests, land, air, and water are degraded, people who live directly off these natural resources suffer most from the effects. People in developed countries, on the other hand, have technologies and conveniences such as air and water filters, refined fuels, and industrially produced and stored foods to buffer themselves from the negative effects of environmental degradation. Global environmental degradation may result from a variety of factors, including overpopulation and the resulting overuse of land and other resources. Intensive farming, for instance, depletes soil fertility and it thus decreases crop yields. Environmental degradation also results from pollution. Polluting industries include mining, power generation, and chemical production. Other major sources of environmental pollution include automobiles and agricultural fertilizers. In Nigeria, deforestation has had particularly devastating environmental effects. Many rural people, particularly in the southern tropical regions, depend on forests as a source of food and other resources, and deforestation damages or eliminates these supplies. Forests also absorb many pollutants and water from extended rains. Without forests, pollution increases and massive flooding further decreases the usability of the deforested areas. Number 6. Certain economic and demographic trends. Poverty in many developed countries can also be linked to economic trends. In the 1950s and 1960s, for example, most people in the United States experienced strong income growth. Taking inflation into account, average family income almost doubled during this period. However, since the early 1970s, typical incomes adjusted for inflation have not grown much, while the cost of living has increased. In particular, many young and less educated people have suffered from this economic shift, as they cannot find jobs that pay enough to support themselves. In Nigeria, the rate of inflation has increased. All the efforts made by the state to stem this rising trend has not been successful. Instead of reducing inflation and poverty, the policies have increased inflation and poverty and created untold hardships for the people. The Structural Adjustment Program (SAP), introduced in 1985 by the General Babangida administration to tackle the problem of inflation by making certain economic adjustments, failed woefully as it led to the creation of a sizable population of desperately poor people. Till date, attempts at controlling poverty, even with the introduction of various programs, have remained nothing more than window dressing programs that increase the capital base of the rich and powerful while pushing the poor majority further to the brink of economic suffocation. Changes in labor markets in developed countries have also contributed to increased poverty levels. For instance, the number of relatively high-paying manufacturing jobs has declined, while the demand for workers in service and technology-related industries have increased. Historically, people have learned the skills required for jobs that involve manual labor, such as those in manufacturing, either on the job or through easily accessible school vocational programs. As these jobs are replaced by service and technology-related jobs, jobs that usually require skills taught at the college level, people who cannot afford a college education find it increasingly difficult to obtain well-paying jobs. Some researchers also cited demographic shifts, changes in the makeup of populations, as contributing to increases in overall poverty. In particular, demographic shifts have led to increases in poverty among children. For instance, typical family structures in Nigeria have changed significantly, leading to an increase in single-parent families, and this tends to make those involved poorer. Single-parent families with children have a much more difficult time escaping poverty than do two-parent families, in which adults can divide and share child care and work duties. Number 7. Individual responsibility and welfare dependency. There are different beliefs about individual responsibility for poverty. In ancient times, poverty was regarded as the manifestation of vices and sins. All the people were taught to enjoy equal opportunity to acquire economic security by their own labor, and those who did not attain such security were seen as morally flawed. Therefore, poverty was a strong proof of moral bankruptcy. The poor were treated accordingly. However, in modern times, poverty and sin has been theoretically declined. There is now a general reluctance to ascribe the misery of the poor to the laws of providence. Some people believe that poverty is a symptom of societal structure and that some people will always be poor. These people feel that poverty is beyond the control of those who experience it. However, some other people feel that the poor intentionally behave in ways that cause or perpetuate their poverty. These people have formulated a cultural theory of poverty, which asserts that the poor lack sufficient desire and motivation to escape poverty. The theory states that the goal of economic security is of lesser importance in the value matrix of the poor. By this hypothesis, the poor are poor only because their culture prevents them from taking advantage of opportunities to escape poverty. As it has been argued, if the poor are culturally bound to poverty, then the task of eliminating poverty becomes increasingly more difficult and time-consuming. Government policy and private efforts must therefore be directed at changing attitudes and environments rather than simply towards changing opportunities. The culture of poverty thesis applies strongly to Nigeria and as such cannot be dismissed lightly. In addition, many people in developed countries blame cycles of poverty or the tendency for the poor to remain poor on overly generous welfare programs. Supporters of this position, including some politicians, argue against government spending and initiatives to help the poor. They believe that these programs provide incentives for people to stay poor in order to continue receiving payments and other support. This argument also suggests that welfare discourages work and marriage. In the United States and other developed countries, getting a job results in reduced welfare support. The same is true when a single parent gets married. However, cash welfare benefits for the typical poor U.S. family with children fell in value by half between the early 1970s and the mid-1990s, taking inflation into account. Such benefits may be too meager to motivate people to stay on welfare or to avoid work or marriage. The effects of poverty. Poverty has wide-ranging and often devastating effects. Many of its effects, such as poor nutrition and physical health problems, result directly from having too little income or too few resources. As a result of poor nutrition and health problems, infant mortality rates among the poor are higher than average, and life expectancies are lower than average. Other effects of poverty may include infectious diseases, mental illness, and drug dependence. Some effects of poverty are not as easily understood. For example, studies have linked poverty to crime, but by no means are all poor people also criminals. In many cases, the primary effects of poverty lead to other problems. Extended hunger and lack of employment, for instance, may lead to depression, which may sometimes contribute to criminal behavior. Number 1. Malnutrition and starvation. Malnutrition is one of the most common effects of poverty. In developing countries, the poorest people cannot afford to eat nutritious foods, to obtain adequate calories, to develop or maintain their appropriate body weight. Poor children often suffer the most, especially from a deficiency known as protein-energy malnutrition. In these cases, children lack protein in their diets, especially from an insufficient amount of mother's milk. Protein-energy malnutrition leads to a variety of problems, including gastrointestinal disorders, stunted growth, poor mental development, and high rates of infections. Prolonged malnutrition can lead to starvation, a condition in which the body's tissues and organs deteriorate. Long-term starvation almost always results in death. In addition to caloric malnutrition, most poor children and adults suffer from severe vitamin and mineral deficiencies. These deficiencies can lead to mental disorders, damage to vital organs, failure of the senses such as poor vision, problem conceiving or delivering babies, and gastrointestinal distress. Even in the major cities of developed countries, the poor often have unhealthy diets, resulting in part from a lack of health care and nutritional education, and in part from the lower availability and higher costs of better quality foods. The urban poor tend to eat too much of the wrong kinds of food. The urban poor commonly eat foods that are fatty or fried, high in sugar and salt, and made of mostly processed carbohydrates. Their diets are often high in low-grade fatty meats, chips, candies, and desserts, and low in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and high-quality lean meats and fish. Such diets commonly cause obesity and hypertension. both of which can contribute to heart disease and other ailments. Number 2. Infectious disease and exposure to the elements. In addition to the effects of malnutrition, the poor experience high rates of infectious diseases. Inadequate shelter or housing creates conditions that promote diseases. Without decent protection, many of the poor are exposed to severe and dangerous weather, as well as to bacteria and viruses carried by other people and animals. In the tropics, monsoons and hurricanes can destroy the flimsy shelters of the poor. Once exposed, people are vulnerable to fluctuations in temperature that lower their resistance to diseases. They also are more likely to become infected with diseases carried by insects or rodents. For instance, mosquitoes carry malaria, a debilitating disease that is common in the tropics. In arid regions, drought leaves the poor without clean water for drinking or bathing. In temperate climates, including in the major cities of developed countries, homelessness is a growing problem. Many of the homeless poor are harmed by or die of exposure to extreme winter cold. Inadequate sanitation and unhygienic practices among the poor also lead to illness. Inadequate sanitation almost always accompanies inadequate shelter. Because the poor in developing nations commonly have no running water or sewage facilities, human excrement and garbage quickly accumulate, and this becomes a breeding ground for diseases. In cities, especially in ghettos and shanty towns that house only poor people, overcrowding can lead to high transmission rates of airborne diseases such as tuberculosis. The poor are also often uneducated about the spread of diseases, notably sexually transmitted diseases, STDs. As a result, and because prophylactic devices such as condoms may be hard to obtain or afford, especially in developing countries, STD rates are high among the poor. In particular, the incidence of acquired immune deficiency syndrome (AIDS) among poor people is higher than average. Along with the problem of high incidences of diseases, developing countries also have shortages of doctors. Medicine and treatment are often both scarce and too expensive for the poor. In addition, many people who live in the rural areas of developing countries cannot get to doctors located in urban areas. In developing countries, the poor may have no health insurance, making the costs of health care unaffordable. Number 3. Mental illness and drug dependence. In most developed countries, the rate of mental illness is highest among the poor. The most common disorders associated with poverty are depression and anxiety disorders. Without meaningful, well-paying work and the resources and social affirmation that come with it, many poor people develop low self-esteem and feelings of worthlessness. People who are stressed by the uncertainty of where they will get their next meal or spend the night often develop high anxiety. Because the poor experience high rates of severe mental illness, they also have high rates of suicide. Some poor people attempt to relieve feelings of anxiety and depression associated with poverty through the use of mind-altering drugs. A common drug among the poor is alcohol, which is legal and affordable. Many of those who drink develop alcoholism, becoming physically and emotionally dependent on drinking. Others use and often become addicted to more dangerous and often illegal drugs, including heroin, methamphetamines, and cocaine. Of these drug users, those who take drug intravenously by injection through a vein and share needles within this process easily contact AIDS. Mental illness and drug dependence demonstrates the difficulties of distinguishing people between poverty's causes and its effects. Mentally ill and drug-dependent people tend to have problems holding steady jobs and maintaining relationships, causing them to fall into poverty. At the same time, in some cases, poverty itself appears to promote mental illness and drug dependence. Number 4. Crime and violence. Some experts believe that poverty leads people to commit acts of violence and crime. Anger, desperation, and the need for money for food, shelter, and other necessities may all contribute to criminal behavior among the poor. Other experts caution that link of cause and effect between poverty and crime is unclear. In some cases, poverty undoubtedly motivates people to commit crime, although it may not be the only factor involved. Other problem associated with poverty is often linked to crime. For example, to obtain money, some poor people commit the crime of selling illegal drugs. Others may steal to obtain the money to buy drugs on which they are dependent. Study session summary. In this lecture, we have discussed the process of poverty to man in society. In the process, we defined what poverty is about, types of poverty, and how it is matured. We also examined the various causes of poverty as well as its effects on man in society. That ends study session 5. Thank you for listening.